Okay. So I thought I would share with you a little of my motivation for why I think about and study the life sciences as part of a humanistic inquiry. And I think before telling you what I think about this topic, I thought I'd share why I care. And I've only recently, after finishing a project around stem cell research, been able to really sit back and reflect, to dream, picking up on the theme, on the thread from the last talk about spaces to dream, and literally places to lie down and just reflect and think. And so this bench is located on the corner of Martin Luther King Avenue and Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley, California. Any Bay Area, Berkeley people? Now, what's special about this intersection is that my favorite flea market is located adjacent, where you can buy secondhand goods, you can hear live drumming every weekend, you can get good curry rotis. It's like my favorite place in the Bay Area. And so I wanted to lay down on this bench because at that time, it was winter in Boston, where I was living, and I had been denied sunlight and vitamin D for some months now. And so I was visiting the Bay Area, and I just wanted to lay down and soak it in and think and reflect and dream. And I was there talking about this stem cell project, and I realized I couldn't lay down on the bench. I couldn't lay down and reflect and dream and soak in the vitamin D. Why couldn't I lay down? Design. More specifically, the armrests, correct? So why do we imagine these armrests were designed onto the bench? What are the multiple reasons they might be there? That's the first thing I thought, to prevent homeless people from lying down. Are there any other reasons why it might have been designed this way? To separate people, this idea that we want our space, right? Even if it's like an imaginary wall of air, we want to know this is mine and this is yours, perhaps. Any other reasons we might brainstorm?
For comfort, just the idea that, look, if you're sitting down,
you want to put your elbows, quite literally, or someone pointed out to me, elderly people may want to use it to lift themselves up, correct? Any other reasons we might think? So the first thing I thought really was this idea that this is located in front of some cute boutiques and antique stores. Business owners don't want homeless people lying on this bench. But what it means also is that none of the rest of us can lie on this bench. And so what it got me thinking after finishing this long project was the way in which something so simple like a bench has these values built into it. Interests, politics, ways of implicitly including and excluding people. And so I thought, if something so simple is designed in this way, maybe not fully consciously, but it has these effects, how much more so for much more complex objects and initiatives, both scientific and political? And what really I care about is the way in which alternative designs, alternative objects are in the process excluded. If we imagine all the different ways we might potentially design something so simple as a bench. Aesthetically, how they might come to life in terms of color, in terms of shape, in terms of what you might be able to do with it, in terms of your body. Maybe not even a bench at all. Sitting on the ground should be an option, right? And so I want us to think about how values, politics, interests are built into the very things we're taught are insulated from these. That is science, right? Scientific initiatives, scientific facts, right, are somehow insulated, right? This is the mythology around objective science. And so I want us to begin to, in the same way we might with the bench, imagine who is implicitly excluded, right, from these processes. Who are the imagined publics that we think are going to benefit from something, and in the process, who are the imagined publics who we either ignore or who could be potentially harmed by these initiatives. And so for me, in this case, it's thinking about where you can't lie down, where you can't dream, where you can't reflect. And so often we are positioned as the consumers, the downstream consumers of scientific advances, rather than the producers of this knowledge and the producers of these facts. So I've been thinking a lot about this bench, And in the last 2 weeks, I ran across this phenomenon. What is this? A bench with spikes in it, and if you want the spikes to go down, what do? So, this extends the metaphor of the public space, the commons, and the privatization of that, right? And many of those same themes run through the science and technology, the biotech that I'm looking at. In this case, this particular bench was designed by a German artist in order to get us to think about the privatization of the public. But, and this is crucial, it's being taken up by different societies as an actual way to implement and design parks. In particular, some Chinese provinces have begun implementing it, right? And so let us extend this metaphor of the bench from the park bench to the lab bench and think about the values, in particular the commoditization of science that it begins to take shape in this sort of post-racial moment. Okay, so now I move to more prepared remarks. The way that I see my contribution to the larger conversation is to get us thinking about what interdisciplinary engagement with the racial politics of the life sciences might look like. I've increasingly come to see this as not only an academic exercise, but as contributing directly to better, more humane science and a more equitable society. Another way to make this point rather bluntly is to say that the life sciences sorely need the kinds of questions and insights that humanists and social scientists and artists are equipped to raise, for reasons that I hope to demonstrate by the end of the talk. And tying into this larger theme we're exploring around the possibilities, and I'd like to emphasize the limits of the non-racial, the main issue I'd like us to wrestle with is how a non-racial imaginary is really ill-equipped to handle the many ways that racism does indeed get under the skin. But that in accounting for this process, what I think of as the biology of racism, we nevertheless step onto the slippery slope into a biological determinism and all its eugenic possibilities. So it becomes necessary to rethink the binary between the universal and the racial as it relates to body, to health, and to biopolitics more broadly, because of the way that racism potentially alters the very thing our genome thought to be immutable. To give you just a quick taste of what I mean by the biology of racism, this recent study examining the DNA of 40 African-American 9-year-olds investigates how chronically stressful conditions impact their long-term health. It examined in particular the children's telomere length as a biomarker of stress. Now, telomeres are these protective caps at the end of our chromosomes that are supposed to prevent them from fraying over time. Shorter telomere length has been linked to various types of cardiovascular disease, strokes, heart attacks, cancer, and diabetes, among other things, so that kids who grow up with chronic stress are more likely to have shorter telomeres. Now, it's possible to conclude different things from this finding. One, it can be construed through a eugenic lens as a racial difference born of a biologically inferior constitution, or more accurately, as a biological manifestation of living in a racist society where harsh living conditions are unevenly distributed. So that how we go about framing, studying, and drawing out the implications of such differences becomes key. So to dive in, my plan is to lay out some of the stakes, first, of interdisciplinary engagement with the life sciences as I see them, from historical to literary to sociological analysis. Because while my own training began in the social sciences, I found it necessary to draw upon a more wide-ranging analytic toolkit to ask the kinds of questions and develop the kinds of analyses that advance our understanding of the multiple ways in which racial logics are at play. Then, after sketching some of these broader conceptual issues, I'll discuss a few examples from my ongoing fieldwork that underpin this query, can the Subaltern Genome Code? Finally, I'll close with a brief discussion of scholarship that I find especially useful for moving this discussion forward, and then I'll open the floor up so that you all can take the conversation in any direction that you find useful. So first, let's start with the social scientific truism that we learn in any intro sociology class, correct? And we take it for granted. Race is a social construct. In terms of policy, we can trace this notion back to at least this 1951 UNESCO statement on race. Here, the drafters state matter-of-factly, scientists are generally agreed that all men belong to a single species and are derived from a common stock. And then further down, they summarize the academic consensus at the time, saying, available scientific knowledge provides no basis for believing that the groups of mankind differ, and that, on the contrary, it indicates that the major factor in explaining such differences is the history of the cultural experience which each group has undergone. The key phrase here is available scientific knowledge. Because fast forward 50 years with the conclusion of the Human Genome Project, and now new bioinformatic tools allow researchers to parse DNA and produce probabilistic differences across populations. A new-old scientific consensus is now gaining steam. New-old because it was never laid to rest by the UNESCO statement and social construction literature in the first place. And it considers racial differences to be inherent. In addition to the hunt for racial differences by life scientists, what is really striking to me is the acceptance of a biologically deterministic logic on the part of some social scientists. Published in 2012 by Shao and colleagues, this paper, entitled The Genomic Challenge to the Social Construction of Race, states, quote, recent research on the human genome challenges the basic assumption that human races have no biological basis. It goes on to say that they offer a theoretical synthesis that accepts the existence of genetic clusters consistent with certain racial classifications. So for those interested in a point-by-point engagement and critique of the article, one is being published any day now in the same journal, Sociological Theory. But for our purposes today, what I want to highlight is that while much has changed between the publication of that UNESCO statement and the Shao paper, one thing has remained relatively constant, and that is the deeply entrenched binary between things dubbed natural and things dubbed social, leaving little conceptual space to grapple with something like the biology of racism. And what I'd like us to consider is how the binary, natural versus social, continues to do a lot of work, epistemic and otherwise. The idea now that what's on the right side of your screen is complex, constructed, dynamic, a social reality, is indeed predicated on an unspoken exclusion or yielding of an imagined, inherent, stable, natural side of human existence found on the left. So that the way that the humanities and social scientists have often engaged with the life sciences, when at all, is to assert the primacy of the social and the bankruptcy of the natural in order to win authority over the study of race, for example, or less common, as in the Shao paper, accept wholesale the claims about nature. But in so doing, we unintentionally reinscribe rather than dismantle this basic division, which is at the heart of so many of our modern binaries. Civilized versus primitive, white versus non-white, man versus woman, developed versus developing, provincial versus cosmopolitan. The second half of each of these binaries is purportedly bound to the natural world, even if romantically so, just as the first half is thought to suffer the complexities of the social. But as we might suspect, the modern sciences have never existed in a value-free bubble. From the first chemistry experiments in the 17th century, the trifecta of race, class, and gender prescribed who would be taken seriously as a legitimate representative of nature. To be taken seriously as nature's spokesperson, one's own voice needed to be rendered neutral. And to be objective, one's own subjectivity needed and still typically needs to remain hidden. The privilege of invisibility in this context links the production of whiteness with the production of objectivity. As this image, my riff on the iconic water fountain photo suggests, racialized subjects are routinely depicted as non-scientific, in part because they're considered too embodied and biased to be capable of a view from nowhere and everywhere, a God's eye view, as Donna Haraway explains, as the hallmark of scientific objectivity. So that when we locate the life sciences in time and place, that is provincializing science, as my work seeks to do. This is both an epistemic and normative challenge, as it opens up an interdisciplinary space to deepen and broaden our collective understanding of this often messy and interesting ways in which the things we call natural are socially and historically fabricated, despite superhuman effort to deny just this. And what do I mean by superhuman effort? Exhibit A of such denial. This New York Times report published just a few months ago, in which a researcher working on this massive new genetic atlas initiative to map the history of what they call population mixing over time, says that in some sense, we don't want to talk to historians. There's a great virtue in being objective. You put the data in and you get the history out. We do think this is a way of reconstructing history by just using the DNA. And so while this kind of DNA centrism is troubling on a number of counts, I was actually quite delighted to see it expressed in such blunt terms. It's an important reminder how for some researchers, the quote, best science is ahistorical and asocial. And thus it pushes us to more fully engage with these fields. Along these lines, if we just try this simple Google exercise, okay, and search for the phrase genes may predict, we get 1.5 million hits. Now, when we type in history may predict, we get 500,000. Not a rigorous investigation by any means, but some indication of the relative salience of genetic versus historical modes of popular inquiry. A final illustration for now of the many concrete ways in which the life sciences draw upon, invigorate, and at times redraw ethno-racial boundaries. In this case, explicitly for commercial gain. DNA Tribes is one of many genetic ancestry testing companies engaged in a kind of objectification of population difference. They say that, quote, instead of relying on socially constructed racial or ethnic divisions, implying these are of lesser value, DNA Tribes defines world regions using objective mathematical criteria. This, as it turns out, is a proprietary statistical method that's applied to over 950 individual population samples around the world to identify groups of populations with shared genetic characteristics. Now, what I want you to note is the binary. These tribes are statistically, that is scientifically, not socially constructed, as if statistics were not itself fundamentally a social practice. Too often, the humanity behind quantitative data are not simply lost in the translation process, but purposely scrubbed to express objectivity. So that humanistic inquiry is this kind of excavation process, slowly, painstakingly reassembling the multiple subjectivities buried beneath the putatively objective symbols. So with that, let's continue digging. Thinking briefly now about the role of language, how it plays in fabricating a biological imaginary that can be more or less racialized. As a reservoir of symbols and codes and stories and metaphors about the world, a field like genetics can shape and often overpower our understanding of how social and political experiences get under the skin. Metaphors in particular serve as heuristics that help us see and not see particular aspects of the worlds we investigate. DNA as a, quote, map, a blueprint, a holy grail, a book of life, which have all been critiqued in one way or another for viewing biology in overly deterministic ways, as if everything can be boiled down to the ACGT alphabet, the tyranny of heritability, as it were. And when this heritability becomes linked to innate racial makeup as it relates to IQ, for example, our metaphors about biology as more or less fixed grow ever more consequential in creating lethal hierarchies. But the good news is that language is malleable, right? And so an alternative set of metaphors have come on the scene to account for the role of interactions, regulation, and environmental factors in gene expression and health outcomes. So here we have networks, recipes, genes as servants of proteins, and even more poetically comparing genetic improvisation to a jazz orchestra. Shout out to Jocelyn, our jazz scholar. And as we imagine, these give us a language to account for indeterminacy, for relationality and fluidity, which again have consequences for how we think about racial differences across a number of contexts. So language matters tremendously. One really provocative article seeks what they call a lingua democratica, rather than a lingua franca for debate on genetics, saying that metaphors can serve as a prophylactic against reification, arguing also for the need to, quote, counteract the privileged position of scientists whose metaphoric descriptions tend to obscure the implicit values hidden in their work, which again echoes our discussion of the bench armrest. So with that conceptual backdrop in place, I want to switch gears now and enter some of the social worlds in which people are using genomics to make competing claims around race and nation, revealing the relative dexterity but also growing hegemony of the field. And what I want to suggest to you is that it's this epistemic agility, that is this normative dexterity that can be used in all different ways, that it actually makes genomics powerful and problematic, not as we might imagine its strict enforcement of hierarchy. So that old way of looking at racial science as, clearly eugenic, this is all going to elude us if we're looking for it in the same form it took in the past. So in 2001, at the World Conference on Racism in Durban, a heated dispute ensued between representatives of the Indian government and some members of the Dalit movement over whether caste discrimination should be included on the international agenda as a form of oppression akin to racism. The Indian government resisted mention of caste in the Proceedings and Outcomes document. And so in 2009, when the Durban Review Committee convened in Geneva to evaluate progress towards the conference goals, a sizable delegation of Dalit representatives traveled to Geneva to, quote, raise their voices against the wall of silence they were met with at the Durban Review Conference. Now, since then, some Dalit activists have actually welcomed genomics research that supports a theory of Aryan migration into India, seeing in it, quote, proof of the idea that the upper castes were alien to the subcontinent. At the same time, the Hindu right has favored studies which suggest that the European contribution to the South Asian gene pool was minimal and hence could be construed as supporting an Aryan indigenousness hypothesis in which their status as outsiders would not be called into question. So population genomics in this context has become an unlikely ally on both sides of a very heated and at times deadly struggle over the legitimate parameters of citizenship. The dexterity of the field, supporting as it does two competing accounts of Indian peoplehood, serves as a window onto this broader context in which this new science of race is taking shape. And whereas social scientists have spent decades working to denaturalize race and highlight its social and political fabrication, in the post-genomics era, we're finding the relationship between biological claims making and political power decoupled in interesting ways. As Nick Rose suggests, the biopolitics of the 21st century do not seek to legitimate inequality, but to intervene upon its consequences, what Catherine Bliss aptly calls an anti-racist racialism. So focusing upon just such interventions my larger project examines these newfangled relations between race, nation, and genomics with a sober eye towards the way that such attempts to intervene in the name of the dispossessed may themselves sediment long-standing inequities. In this way, it builds upon work cautioning that our ability to intervene upon life in unprecedented ways may not be cause for celebration. In the words of Dorothy Roberts, this new form of biocitizenship, quote, threatens to replace active collective engagement to create a better society with providing information to the biotech industry and consuming its goods and services. So this brings us to one of several major dynamics that I suggest fuel these racial and nationalist logics and longings. To understand population genomics, not simply as a scientific discipline, but as part of a broader social field with political implications that exceed the intentions of researchers. It's important to note that the field is advancing at a time when the international pharmaceutical industry faces a major crisis. An estimated $140 billion worth of drugs will lose their patents between 2012 and 2017. And companies now are under pressure to reconfigure their business models and find new markets as blockbuster drugs fall over the so-called patent cliff. So the one-size-fits-all model of drug development is giving way to a niche marketing strategy in which companies now are turning to growth potential in specialty markets and in emerging nations. So one way of resuscitating intellectual property claims and establishing a marketing niche is by employing racial ethnic categories. That is, racialized understandings of biological difference is the value added. So although personalized medicine is the umbrella under which these practices typically fall, many analysts are cautioning that race serves as a detour to individualized treatments, a permanent detour. Jonathan Kahn points out that as companies attempt to tailor therapies ever more closely to the genetic profile of individuals or groups of consumers, identifying racial or ethnic correlations with disease are becoming big business. In terms of marketing drugs, we can imagine groups, not individuals, comprise the necessary market. In response to this rabid global biocapitalism, a number of countries in the global south are seeking to control the terms of this expansion, rather than simply allow foreign researchers and pharmaceutical companies to approach their populations as resources for genetic samples and as markets for new drugs. And the policy framework for exercising this control has been dubbed genomic sovereignty. As one US-based investor recently lamented, the expansion of big pharma into foreign markets has, quote, hit a roadblock, nationalism. One prominent Mexican official explained the need for Mexico's genomic sovereignty amendment, which was codified in 2008 in these terms. We believe that if we do not carry out studies to understand our genomic patrimony, no one will, because they'll be interested in their own populations. Secondly, should the interest exist and they come to get this information, they make us dependent upon it, and then it'll cost us. We have to develop our own genomic information. So in this context, new biopolitical entities are being imagined. Mexican DNA, Indian DNA, and a little closer to home, the anti-apartheid genome, among others, as part of a biopolitical imaginary that's strategically calibrating existing social differences, such as race ethnicity, with genetic groupings. On the surface now, genomic sovereignty asserts a deeply nationalist sentiment of self-determination in a time of increasing globalization, something we might indeed be sympathetic to. It implicitly brands national populations as biologically distinct, naturalizing nation-state boundaries to ensure that countries receive the economic and medical benefits that may result. But as the late legal scholar Keith Aoki reminds us, invocations of nation sovereignty vis-a-vis an international order are always foundationally wrapped up in the question of nation sovereignty over the subjects contained within their boundaries. So instead of celebrating genomic sovereignty as post-colonial empowerment, Such claims are better examined for the kinds of intranational power relations that they at once hide rather than combat. So here I'd like to briefly touch upon two examples of what I mean by intranational. First, illustrating the persistence of whiteness as a form of biological property that subgroups in different regions, mestizos in Mexico, upper castes in India, are thought to have more of when compared to other populations. My point is that there's a latent tension between the ethos of empowerment and self-determination articulated by genomic sovereignty on the one hand, and the fetishization and normalization of whiteness on the other. In one of the first major studies to come out of the Mexican initiative, results support what researchers say we already know about group composition in the Mexican case, as group composition. In the Mexican case, as in much of Latin America, diversity mapping rests upon the cultural scaffolding of mestizaje, more indigenous in the south, more African on the coast, and more white in the northern regions, we're told. Not simply north as in geographically higher, but also perhaps in the way that whiteness confers a higher position in the social order, and lighter members of the body politic monopolize political and economic power. In part, what's at stake in this process is that intranational hierarchies in Mexico and elsewhere are granted scientific legitimacy, so that eugenic pure types of old are giving way to this idea of empowered mixed types, so that domination is euphemized as mere difference. A second example of this is found in India before the Indian Genome Variation Project was established. Much of the focus was on delineating the genomic basis of the caste hierarchy, as seen in this study. Quote, the upper caste Indian male population is genetically, can you see that? No, you can't. Okay, genetically closer to Europeans than the lower castes, which are more Asian. So this fetishization of whiteness is what typically gets taken up in popular discourse, as with this Times of India headline, upper caste India male, more European, says study. This notion, of course, rests on this older story of Aryan invasion that supposedly civilized the Indic peoples of the subcontinent. It's what one commentator calls India's own peculiar kind of whiteness, evidenced most prominently in the fair skin complex that's been part of the Indian and Pan-Asian aesthetic for hundreds of years, amplified in recent decades by the lucrative skin lightening industry, and now in part legitimized by population genomics. Connecting this point to the sociological concern with different forms of group making, I'm also interested in how genomic expertise is rubbing up against other disciplinary forms of knowing population history and the political implications of these frictions. Consider the claim by a group of genomicists, Risch et al. They say that some historians have argued that caste in modern India is an invention of colonialism. However, our results indicate that many current distinctions among groups are ancient, and that strong endogamy must have shaped marriage patterns in India for thousands of years. Here again, we find an echo of the New York Times quote at the beginning, in which genomics positions itself as an arbiter of historical facts versus fictions. So now, before opening things up to the group, I'd like to draw on some recent happenings in Southern Africa with respect to genomic narratives of belonging. This past September, I participated in a workshop in Kimberley, South Africa, which was organized by colleagues at WITS and University of Pretoria in response to two developments. So this is what the workshop came out of. The first was the publication of a 2010 paper in the journal Nature, which raised serious concerns about the ethics and politics of genomics. The Nature researchers, based in the US and Australia, reported the genetic structure of the four individuals shown here. The Khoisan are considered by many scientists the oldest known lineage of modern humans, so they become extremely valuable around the world when researchers are seeking to understand human diversity. According to the paper, quote, until now, fully sequenced human genomes have been limited to recently diverged populations. In terms of nucleotide substitutions, the Bushmen seem to be, on average, more different from each other than, for example, a European and an Asian, end quote. So this study, as it turns out, also includes a fifth individual who we come to find out is none other than Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So he got himself genotyped. Hence, there was added buzz and circulation of the results. The headline was that Tutu was found to have San ancestry that he didn't know about. An interesting revelation, as you'll see, when it comes to one of the main themes that emerged in the workshop. Another thing to note about this nature study is that it was approved by Penn State's IRB, the University of Limpopo Ethics Committee, and the Human Research Ethics Committee of the University of New South Wales, Australia. So by all accounts, this was a highly vetted study. Readers are told that, quote, all participants consented either in writing or via video recorded verbal consent, and that the collection of human DNA in Namibia was conducted under a permit by the Ministry of Health and Social Services of the Namibian government. Alongside the publication in early 2010, the Nature researchers hosted a public forum in Windhoek, Namibia, to present their findings. At the meeting, a member of the San community stood up and asked the researchers why they had bypassed the community councils in the consent and sampling process. In response, Australian researcher Vanessa Hayes, shown here, insisted that the team had followed established informed consent protocol to the letter and that permission from the Namibian government sanctioned the research. End of story. So in part, what I want you to think about is the difference between bioethics and biopolitics in the story. So some concerned South African researchers, ethicists, and lawyers decided to convene a series of workshops in which the council members from Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa came together to discuss the issues they had with both the Nature paper and genomics research more broadly. The director of the South African Genome Program hoped to begin a partnership, as he called it, with the councils to establish best practices going forward. In part, they were trying not to do what the US and Australian researchers had done. So here I'll quickly highlight 3 recurring themes from the workshop. The first is the issue of benefit sharing that came up a number of times, with plans to train the San to contribute directly to research as the most tangible goal. Here an interesting tension arose between an ideal of open access science and accountability versus accountability to the community. So the genomicists in the room explained that they had to make the information derived from the San samples available to the global research community, and that after a benefit sharing arrangement was established between themselves and the councils, that contract would not necessarily apply to other researchers who might make use of the information. So we spent a considerable amount of time discussing whether it would be possible to build in protocols whereby other researchers would have to reconsent the San about additional uses of their genomic samples and adhere to benefit sharing norms. The researchers seemed skeptical about whether this would be possible, saying once it's in the public domain, what happens is out of their hands, which troubled council members a great deal. A second theme was the possible stigma associated with medical genomics. For example, council members wanted to know if researchers found a certain percentage of the San were affected by HIV, were they obligated to make this public? And would they necessarily tell the individuals affected? There was a discussion about whether people necessarily want this information, pushing back against the scientific norm that more is always better. Researchers assured council members that people can decide beforehand what, if anything, they wish to learn from the medical genomics tests. Although it's worth noting here, there was a hint of why wouldn't you want to know, right, behind that reassurance. And whether or not individuals held agency, the fact that so many studies that come out of this are framed in terms of ethno-racial group susceptibility, this may nevertheless produce collective stigma, whether you individually decide not to know. Needless to say, the San, like many other groups, have a fraught relationship with biomedicine. As one council member explained, the clinic they go to gives out medicine that often makes individuals feel worse. Quote, "Doctors are killing us, not treating us," he said. Interestingly enough, this experience became the grounds for both researchers and council members to recognize the value of individualized treatments. That is, there was a tentative understanding among workshop participants that perhaps the medicine was often harmful because the doctors lacked genomic information about the San and not necessarily other socioeconomic and structural reasons for the medicine not working. Finally, a third theme developed around ancestry tests, what we might call diagnosing indigeneity, as this refers to the query raised by council members a number of times about whether genomics could tell us if someone was truly San or not. After all, if as the researchers said countless times, there's something special about the San DNA that makes it valuable to the South African Genome Program, quote, then surely you scientists can tell us who has this special DNA and who doesn't, going back to the Tutu revelation. Researchers' response that in fact no such diagnosis of identity was possible was initially hard to grasp since they presented medical genomics with such precision. So why couldn't the same techniques being used to diagnose identity? So embedded in each of these three themes, there's a kind of biopolitics of representation at work. With benefit sharing, the councils hope to represent the interests of the San vis-a-vis the research community and ensure they gain something tangible from donating samples, a profitable representation. With medical genomics, there's a concern that the San will be stigmatized as a population plagued by illnesses, so a potentially harmful representation. And with ancestry tests, there's a hope that science can serve as an objective arbiter of who can lay claim to San identity and gain political recognition. A kind of authentic representation was at issue. One thing we might consider in our discussion is how a non-racial imaginary is at times cast in this context as a form of neglect, that is, ignoring important differences, whereas at other times a racial imaginary is the potential threat, as when a group is stigmatized as harboring contagious diseases. In thinking about this proliferation of genomic imaginaries, that is its dexterity, I want to highlight the work of Wits professor Dimitri Erasmus, as it speaks to the larger epistemic and biopolitical stakes of South African ancestry testing, because her insights I find especially useful for critically engaging the life sciences more broadly. In an incisive article entitled Throwing the Genes, she compares the thin empirical evidence upon which genetic forecasting is based to the work of shamans who throw bones for a, quote, mythical reading of forces that shape how one sees oneself in the world. Questioning, quote, why a single bioimaginary in the presence of a range of other imaginaries about belonging and interconnectedness happens to be the prime choice for framing ideas about belonging in this DNA age. Erasmus pushes back against this idea of genomics as an empowerment idiom, which I describe in the work on genomic sovereignty. In her words, quote, which and whose histories, which and whose knowledge systems do we think and act from? A crucial question, I think, for framing our conversation around race science and subjectivity. So in returning to the opening discussion about metaphors in and about science, what I'd like to suggest is that we think about the San genome and other such biopolitical entities, the Mexican genome, the Indian genome, as a kind of text around which there are struggles over who will translate, to what audiences, and to what ends. As the director of the South African Human Genome Program explained, the sheer quantity of information contained in the genome is analogous, in his words, to 6,000 books, 1,000 pages per book, with 1,000 letters per page. So basically, a whole lot of information. Here he is, sorry, I'll just skip over here. Here he is holding a computer chip that he says can hold, and which can hold, this massive amount of data. But as so often happens when that book of life metaphor is invoked, questions about who has the power and expertise to translate and infer meaning from genomic information are often obscured. The fact is, representing nature is no straightforward act of reading and translating code. Instead, following Corey Hayden's proposition that scientific knowledge does not simply represent in the sense of depict nature, but it also represents in the political sense the social interests of the people and institutions that have become wrapped up in its production. Similarly, for Michel Caillon, to speak for others is to first silence those in whose name we speak. This suggests that there's an element of ventriloquism in representative practices. Sorry, I want to go back here. wherein spokespeople both represent and fashion the biosocial world through symbols, language, and increasingly bioinformatics. In the context of South African genomics, we can see how researchers and council members don't simply represent, but also produce the legitimate boundaries of populations. And so the fact that socially subordinate groups increasingly claim recognition and assert rights in genomic terms is something we must continue to grapple with, as simultaneously co-optation of and capitulation to science, with unforeseen consequences along the way. As Erasmus cautions, it's partly on the basis of genomic findings that the Khoisan can and have claimed First Nation status and are fighting for admission to South Africa's House of Traditional Leaders, an institutional with questionable status in a democracy, end quote. At the same time, the San are increasingly connected to pan-indigenous human rights networks, such as the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism. That is, not only is the scientific training in South Africa characterized by a great deal of transnational exchange, as Anne Pollock's work reveals, so too are the ethical and political grammars being developed to appropriate and speak back to the science. So one way of conceptualizing this notion of speaking back, and here I'm winding down, don't worry, stretch, you guys can do it. One way to conceptualize this notion of speaking back to genetic codes is as a form of political and epistemological hacking. So if we think about computer programming as a variant of free speech and free assembly, as Chris Kelty's work that does, then spaces like the Kimberley Workshop are potentially hacking spaces, creating new things, new practices, and new forms of life. It was there that council members insisted that the bioethical standard of informed consent was not enough. Instead, there should be a space to cultivate an informed refusal to participate in research. This relates again to Kelty's notion of hacking as, quote, understanding a system well enough to control it and to make it do something it wasn't meant to do, not just to demystify it. So again, in recentering language and meaning at a time when the zeros and ones of computer code and the ACGTs of genetic code are central to contemporary racial and nationalist imaginaries, I want to open the floor for us to engage a broader, more socially robust imagination of what constitutes life of citizenship and belonging. And in doing so, I urge us not to run away from the biological. Instead, let's question who gets to speak on behalf of our bodies and to what ends, theorizing the biological as always already a site of subjectivity as well as potential subjection. Thank you for your attention.